The Hollow Man. Chapter 1. The First Body. Detective Jack Lawson had seen plenty of gruesome crime scenes in his 20 years on the force, but this one was different. The body lay sprawled in the middle of the room, eyes wide open, staring into nothingness. Blood pooled around the lifeless form, yet there was no sign of a struggle. No fingerprints, no weapon, nothing. As he examined the scene, the air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing down on him, as if an unseen presence was watching his every move. It was unsettling, to say the least, and it wasn't just the eerie silence or the overwhelming sense of dread that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. It was something deeper, something he couldn't quite place. "Detective Lawson, over here," called Officer Reed, breaking the silence. Jack turned to see Reed standing by the window, his face pale. Jack walked over, his heart pounding in his chest. Reed pointed to the glass, and for a moment, Jack didn't understand what he was seeing. Then it hit him like a ton of bricks. There, imprinted on the outside of the window, was the faint outline of a hand. It was smeared across the glass, as if someone had pressed their hand against it before vanishing into thin air. "The door was locked from the inside," Reed said, his voice shaky. "No one could have gotten in or out." Jack's mind raced. An intruder who leaves no trace, who can enter and exit a locked room without being seen. It was impossible. But then again, so was everything about this case. "Get forensics to check that print," Jack ordered, trying to keep his voice steady. "I want to know if it's from inside or outside." Reed nodded and hurried off, leaving Jack alone with the corpse once more. He looked back at the body, a creeping unease settling in his gut. Who was this killer? And how could they commit such a brutal act without leaving any evidence? As Jack stood there, staring at the lifeless eyes of the victim, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It was as if the killer was still in the room, invisible, waiting for his next move. A sudden thought flashed through Jack's mind, something that sent a chill down his spine. What if the killer wasn't just invisible? What if he wasn't human at all? The idea seemed absurd, but so did everything else about this case. He needed answers, and he needed them fast before more bodies turned up. Jack had a feeling this was just the beginning. He was right. If you're intrigued by the mystery of the Hollow Man, subscribe now to follow Detective Jack Lawson's harrowing journey as he faces an invisible terror. Chapter 2. The Disappearance. The morning air was crisp and cold as Jack arrived at the police station, the events of the previous night still gnawing at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, that this case was going to be unlike anything he'd ever encountered before. As he walked into the precinct, his partner, Detective Maria Vasquez, was already waiting for him. She had a grim look on her face, and Jack knew it wasn't good news. "Jack, we've got another one," Maria said without preamble. "A woman was reported missing this morning. Her husband came home to find the door locked from the inside, but she was gone. No sign of forced entry, no struggle, just vanished." Jack felt his blood run cold. "Just like the last one?" "Worse," Maria replied, handing him a folder. There was a message left behind this time. Jack opened the folder and saw a photograph of the scene. Scrawled on the wall in what looked like blood were the words, "You can't catch what you can't see." "Jesus," Jack muttered under his breath. "Is this a joke?" "I wish it were," Maria said, her voice low. "But it's real, Jack, and it's happening again." Jack stared at the photograph, a sinking feeling in his gut. This killer was playing with them, taunting them. Whoever or whatever they were confident, too confident. "This isn't a normal case, Maria," Jack said finally, closing the folder. "We're dealing with something else. Something unnatural." Maria didn't argue. She'd seen enough strange things in her time as a detective to know when something didn't add up. And this case was full of contradictions. "What do we do?" she asked. "We follow the evidence," Jack replied, though he wasn't sure what evidence they even had. We have to figure out how this killer is getting in and out without being seen. And we have to do it fast before more people go missing." Maria nodded, but Jack could see the doubt in her eyes. He felt it too. How do you catch a killer you can't even see? As they headed out to the new crime scene, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap, that the killer was always one step ahead of them, watching, waiting. The message on the wall echoed in his mind. You can't catch what you can't see. But Jack was determined to prove the killer wrong, even if it killed him. Want to see how Jack plans to catch the invisible killer? Make sure to subscribe and share the suspense with others. Chapter 3. The Shadow. The crime scene at the missing woman's house was eerily similar to the first. No signs of a struggle, no forced entry, nothing to suggest where she might have gone or how. The only difference was the bloodied message on the wall, a chilling reminder that they were dealing with a killer who was toying with them. Jack and Maria combed through the house, searching for any clue, no matter how small, that might explain what had happened. But the more they searched, the more it became clear that this killer was a ghost, slipping through their fingers like smoke. "I don't get it," Maria said, frustration creeping into her voice. "How can someone just vanish like this? There's nothing here." Jack didn't respond immediately. His eyes were drawn to the message on the wall, his mind racing with possibilities. He was starting to believe the unbelievable, that their suspect wasn't just a master of deception but something more, something beyond their understanding. "Jack," Maria's voice broke through his thoughts. "I don't know, Maria," he admitted, his voice laced with frustration. "But whatever we're dealing with, it's not something we've ever faced before." Maria sighed, running a hand through her hair. "So what do we do now? Wait for the next one?" Jack frowned. "No, we can't just sit around and wait for this maniac to strike again. We need to be proactive." "Proactive how?" Jack turned to face her, a determined look in his eyes. "We need to think outside the box. If this killer isn't human, or isn't playing by the same rules, we need to figure out what those rules are." Maria gave him a skeptical look, but there was a flicker of hope in her eyes. "You think there's a pattern?" "Maybe," Jack said slowly, his mind piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. "But if there is, it's not a pattern we're used to seeing. We need to look at this from a different angle, find something we've missed." Maria nodded. "All right, let's do it. But where do we start?" Before Jack could answer, his phone rang. He pulled it out of his pocket and saw the caller ID, Captain Harris. "Lawson," the captain's voice was gruff, tense. "We've got a situation downtown. Another body." Jack felt his heart drop. "Another one?" "Yes, but this one's different. We caught it on camera." Jack's blood ran cold. "What did you see?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Harris spoke again, his voice was low, almost fearful. "You need to see it for yourself. It doesn't make any sense." Jack exchanged a look with Maria, his mind racing. "We're on our way." As they rushed to the scene, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of something terrifying, something that defied explanation. The killer had left them a clue, and now, for the first time, they might be able to see him. But the question remained, could they stop him? Or were they merely stepping deeper into his trap? Is the killer truly invisible? Or is there something more sinister at play? Stay tuned and subscribe to uncover the truth with Detective Jack Lawson. Chapter 4. The Footage. The precinct was buzzing with activity when Jack and Maria arrived. Officers moved hurriedly through the halls, their faces grim. The tension in the air was palpable, as if everyone could sense that something was terribly wrong. Captain Harris was waiting for them in the surveillance room, his expression as serious as Jack had ever seen it. Without a word, he led them to a monitor where a video was paused, the image frozen on a frame that showed the exterior of a downtown building. "This was taken an hour ago," Harris said, his voice low. "The building's security cameras caught the whole thing." He pressed play and the video began. The footage showed a deserted alleyway, dark and quiet. Then, out of nowhere, a man appeared. A figure in a dark coat, his face obscured by a hood. He walked into the frame, his movements deliberate, as if he knew exactly where he was going. "Is that him?" Maria asked, her eyes fixed on the screen. Harris nodded. "Watch." The figure approached the side door of the building, but instead of reaching for the handle, he simply stood there. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, as if by magic, the door swung open by itself, and the man stepped inside. Jack's breath caught in his throat. "How the hell?" Harris paused the video and turned to them, his expression grim. "It gets worse." He fast-forwarded the footage until the man reappeared, this time carrying something. A limp figure draped over his shoulder. Jack's heart pounded as he realized it was a body, lifeless and pale. But it wasn't just the body that made Jack's skin crawl. It was what happened next. The man walked back to the alley, but instead of leaving the way he came, he stopped in the middle of the frame. Then, as they watched, he began to fade, his outline growing fainter, his form becoming transparent until he disappeared entirely, as if he had never been there at all. Maria gasped, her hand covering her mouth. What the hell was that?" Jack felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He didn't have an answer. Nothing in his years as a detective had prepared him for this. How do you catch someone who can vanish into thin air? "What do we do now?" Maria asked, her voice shaky. Jack stared at the blank screen, his mind racing. This was no ordinary killer, and they were no closer to catching him than they had been at the start. But one thing was clear, they were dealing with something far beyond their understanding. "We keep looking," Jack said finally, though he had no idea what they were even looking for. "We find out how he's doing this, and we stop him." But deep down, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were in way over their heads, that this killer was playing a game they couldn't win. And the worst part was, he knew it. Are you hooked? Subscribe and share the suspense as Detective Jack Lawson faces an adversary who defies all logic. What will happen next? Chapter 5. The Whisper. The precinct was quiet, unnervingly so, as Jack and Maria sat in Jack's office, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. The video replayed over and over in their minds, each detail burned into their memories. But no matter how many times they went over it, the answer remained elusive. "How do you fight something like this?" Maria finally asked, breaking the silence. "Something that can just disappear?" Jack didn't have an answer. He wanted to believe there was a logical explanation, that this was some elaborate trick or illusion. But deep down, he knew better. This was real. The evidence was right in front of them, as impossible as it seemed. "We're missing something," Jack said, his voice firm. "There has to be a way to track him, to predict where he'll strike next." "But how?" Maria pressed. "He's like a ghost, Jack. No prints, no witnesses, no trace." Jack leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "We need to think outside the box. What if this isn't just about physical evidence? What if there's something else at play here? Something supernatural?" Maria looked at him, her expression a mix of skepticism and concern. "You really think this is some kind of paranormal thing?" Jack hesitated. He wasn't the type to believe in ghosts or monsters, but this case had shattered his preconceptions. "I don't know, Maria, but we can't ignore what we've seen. We have to be open to every possibility." Before Maria could respond, there was a knock on the door. It was Officer Reed, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Detective, you need to see this," Reed said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jack and Maria exchanged a glance before following Reed out into the hallway. He led them to the evidence room where a small television had been set up, connected to a security camera feed. "What is it, Reed?" Jack asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Reed didn't answer. He just pointed to the screen. Jack's blood ran cold. The camera was focused on one of the holding cells, where they occasionally kept suspects before transfer. Inside the cell, a man sat on the cot, his back to the camera. But it wasn't the man that caught Jack's attention. It was the writing on the wall behind him. Scrawled in what looked like blood were the words, "I'm watching you." "Who is that?" Maria asked, her voice trembling. Reed swallowed hard. "We don't know. He wasn't there a few minutes ago." The cell was empty. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. The man in the cell hadn't moved, hadn't turned to face the camera. But something about the situation felt off, like the calm before a storm. "We need to get down there," Jack said, already heading for the stairs. Maria and Reed were right behind him, their footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. When they reached the holding area, they found the door to the cell block ajar. Jack pushed it open, his heart pounding in his chest. The cell was just as they had seen on the monitor, the man still sitting on the cot, the words still fresh on the wall. "Who are you?" Jack demanded, his voice echoing in the small space. The man didn't respond. He didn't move. "Turn around," Jack ordered, stepping closer, his hand hovering near his gun. Slowly, the man began to move, turning his head to face them. Jack felt a wave of nausea as he saw the man's face. Pale, gaunt, eyes sunken deep into his skull. But it was the eyes that made Jack's blood run cold. They were empty, hollow, as if the man's soul had been drained away, leaving nothing but a shell behind. And then, without warning, the man began to speak. His voice a raspy whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You can't stop him," the man hissed, a twisted smile spreading across his face. "He's already here." Jack's heart skipped a beat. Who's here?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he dissolved into a fit of laughter, the sound echoing off the walls, growing louder and louder until it was all Jack could hear. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the laughter stopped. The man slumped forward, lifeless, his body collapsing onto the cot. Jack rushed forward, checking for a pulse, but there was nothing. The man was dead. "What the hell just happened?" Maria whispered, her face pale. Jack didn't have an answer. All he knew was that they were dealing with something far beyond their understanding, something that could strike at any moment. And it was getting closer. Are you ready for more? Subscribe now and share the suspense with others as Detective Jack Lawson faces a terror unlike any other. Chapter 6. The Revelation. The precinct was on lockdown. Officers patrolled the hallways, their eyes darting nervously as they passed each door and window. The fear was palpable, a heavy weight that hung over everyone, suffocating and relentless. No one knew what to expect next, only that something terrible was coming. Jack sat in his office, the door closed, his mind racing. The encounter with the man in the cell had shaken him to his core. He had seen many things in his career, but nothing like this. It was as if they were dealing with a force that defied all logic, a darkness that had no form or face, yet was everywhere. Maria entered the office, closing the door behind her. She looked as shaken as Jack felt, her face pale and drawn. "Jack, we need to figure this out, before it's too late." "I know," Jack said, his voice hoarse. "But how? Every time we get close, it slips away. This thing, whatever it is, it's playing with us. There has to be something we're missing," Maria insisted, pacing the small room. "Some clue, some connection that we haven't seen yet." Jack stared at the wall, his mind going over every detail of the case. The bodies, the messages, the man in the cell. It all pointed to something larger, something he couldn't quite grasp. But there was a pattern, he was sure of it. And if they could just see it, they might have a chance. Suddenly, Jack remembered something. An old case, long closed, that had always bothered him. A series of disappearances that had never been solved, where the victims had vanished without a trace, just like in this case. Could it be connected? "Maria," Jack said, sitting up straight, "I think I know where to start." Maria stopped pacing and looked at him, her eyes narrowing. What do you mean? There was a case about 10 years ago, Jack explained. A string of disappearances. They never found the bodies, but there were rumors. Crazy, impossible rumors. About a shadowy figure that could move through walls, vanish into thin air. Are you saying this has happened before? Maria asked, her voice tense. I'm saying it might be connected, Jack replied. The details are too similar to ignore. If we can find the old case files, maybe there's something in there that can help us. Maria nodded, her expression determined. All right, let's dig them up. Maybe this is the break we've been waiting for. They spent the next few hours going through old records, sifting through dusty files and faded photographs. The further they dug, the more convinced Jack became that this wasn't just a new case. It was a continuation of something much older, something that had been lurking in the shadows for decades. Finally, they found what they were looking for. A series of reports from the 1980s detailing similar disappearances, each one more bizarre than the last. But it wasn't just the crimes that caught Jack's attention. It was the name of the detective in charge. Detective Henry Cole, Jack read aloud, his voice tinged with disbelief. He was the lead investigator on all of these cases, but he disappeared himself in 1989. The case was never solved. Maria looked at him, her eyes wide. You think this Cole guy is connected to our killer? Jack nodded slowly. I think he might be our killer, or what's left of him. Maria frowned. What do you mean? Look at these reports, Jack said, spreading the files out on the desk. The way the victims disappeared, the lack of evidence, the supernatural elements, it's all too similar. And if Cole was investigating this for years, maybe he found something. Something that changed him, turned him into whatever this is. Maria stared at the files, her expression a mix of fear and realization. But why? Why would he do this? Jack shook his head. I don't know, but we need to find out. If we can figure out what happened to Cole, we might be able to stop this. But how do we find him? Maria asked, her voice tinged with desperation. He's a ghost, Jack. He could be anywhere. Jack didn't have an answer. All he knew was that time was running out, and they were the only ones who could stop whatever horror was coming. We start with his old house, Jack said finally, his voice firm. If there are answers, they'll be there. Maria nodded, but Jack could see the doubt in her eyes. He felt it too. This wasn't just a hunt for a killer, it was a fight against something far darker, something that had been waiting in the shadows for decades. And now it was ready to strike. Can Detective Jack Lawson uncover the truth before it's too late? Don't miss the final chapter. Subscribe now and share the suspense with others. Chapter 7. The Hollow Man. The drive to Henry Cole's old house was silent, the weight of what they were about to face pressing down on them like a heavy fog. The address was deep in the outskirts of the city, far from the prying eyes of civilization, where the streetlights faded into darkness and the trees loomed like silent sentinels. As Jack navigated the winding roads, his mind raced with questions. How had Henry Cole gone from a respected detective to this? What had he uncovered that twisted him into a monster, a ghost who could move through walls and disappear at will? The house appeared through the mist like a specter, its darkened windows staring blankly at the world. It was a relic of another time, weathered and forgotten, with peeling paint and overgrown weeds that reached up like clawing fingers. The air around it was still heavy with the weight of years gone by. This place gives me the creeps, Maria muttered as they stepped out of the car, her eyes scanning the surroundings warily. Jack couldn't disagree. There was something deeply wrong about this place, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. But they had no choice, they had to see this through. They approached the front door, which hung slightly ajar, creaking on its hinges as a gust of wind swept through. Jack pushed it open the rest of the way, and they stepped inside, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The interior was as decrepit as the outside. Dust covered every surface, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. Old furniture lay strewn about, as if abandoned in haste, and the wallpaper was peeling away, revealing dark stains beneath. "Where do we start?" Maria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack glanced around, his eyes narrowing. "We search every room. Look for anything that might give us a clue. Old files, notes, anything." They split up, moving through the house with a sense of urgency. Jack headed towards what appeared to be an office, the door creaking loudly as he pushed it open. Inside, the walls were lined with bookshelves, and a large desk sat in the center, covered in a thick layer of dust. Jack approached the desk, his eyes scanning the clutter of papers and old case files. Most of it was unremarkable, old police reports, notes on various cases, but then something caught his eye. A small, leather-bound journal, hidden beneath a stack of papers, its pages yellowed with age. He picked it up, feeling a strange sense of dread as he opened it. The handwriting was cramped and hurried, as if the author had been racing against time. As Jack read, his heart began to pound. The journal detailed Henry Cole's descent into madness. It started with the disappearances, the same ones Jack and Maria had been investigating. But as the entries continued, they grew darker, more frantic. Cole had become obsessed, convinced that the killer he was hunting wasn't human, that he was dealing with something far more sinister. Jack's eyes widened as he read the final entry, dated just days before Cole's own disappearance. Asterisk, "I've seen him. The Hollow Man. He's not like us. He's everywhere and nowhere. A shadow that moves through the walls. A whisper that steals the breath from your lungs. I can't stop him, but I can become him." Asterisk. Jack's blood ran cold. He could hardly believe what he was reading. Was Cole claiming he had become this Hollow Man? That he had somehow transformed into the very thing he was hunting? A sudden noise from upstairs broke his concentration. A crash, followed by Maria's shout. Jack's heart leaped into his throat as he bolted from the room, sprinting up the creaking staircase 2 steps at a time. He burst into a dimly lit hallway, where he found Maria standing in front of a door at the end, her gun drawn, her face pale. "What happened?" Jack demanded, rushing to her side. Something moved in there," Maria whispered, her voice trembling. "I heard it, Jack. It was like a whisper, but it was everywhere." Jack's hand tightened around his gun as he reached for the doorknob. He hesitated, his mind racing with everything he had just read. Was Cole really inside, waiting for them? Or was it something worse? Taking a deep breath, Jack pushed the door open. The room was dark, the only light coming from a small, flickering bulb in the corner. It was empty, save for a large mirror that hung on the far wall, its surface cracked and stained. But it wasn't the mirror that caught Jack's attention. It was the figure standing in front of it. The man was tall, his frame gaunt and thin, his face obscured by the hood of a dark coat. But Jack knew who it was. He had seen that figure before in the footage, in the reports. "Henry Cole," Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure turned slowly, its movements unnatural, as if the joints were stiff, unused. When the face finally emerged from the shadows, Jack felt his blood run cold. The eyes were hollow, empty sockets that stared back at him with an inhuman emptiness. "You can't stop him," the figure rasped, its voice like a distant echo. "He's already inside you." Before Jack could react, the figure dissolved into smoke, fading into the air like a wisp of shadow. For a moment, the room was silent, the only sound the pounding of Jack's heart in his ears. And then the mirror cracked, a spiderweb of fractures spreading across its surface. From within the cracks, something began to emerge. A dark, shifting form that writhed and twisted as it broke free from the glass. Jack and Maria backed away, their guns raised, but they knew it was useless. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't something they could fight with bullets. The shadow took form, growing larger, more defined, until it stood before them, the Hollow Man. His presence filled the room, oppressive and suffocating. His hollow eyes locked onto Jack. "You've seen him," the voice whispered, though Jack couldn't tell if it was coming from the creature or from within his own mind. "Now he sees you." Jack's vision blurred, darkness closing in from all sides. He tried to fight it, to stay conscious, but it was no use. The last thing he saw was Maria collapsing beside him, the shadow enveloping them both, swallowing them into the void. And then, there was nothing. The end. If you enjoyed our story, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications.